Hey, it's your Pocket Skeptimist again. Now, as scientifically literate and skeptical people, we do often in public conversation come across paranormal claims. So we do tend to spend at least a small portion of our time having to deal with them, think about them, and confront them. So I thought I would run a short series on the history of the paranormal, just to give the listeners a bit of a wider context into why I personally find that I need to criticise the majority of paranormal claims, and also to distinguish the kinds of paranormal claim that I do criticise from those which I don't, and give some reasons why that might be the case. So let's delve into the world of parahistory. So let's look a bit of etymology first. The word paranormal is one of the English language's most loaded loanwords, stitched together in the early 20th century from borrowed Latin and Greek. However, in my view, given that the Enlightenment had begun in Europe over 2 centuries earlier, it's a term that never had any sensible use in English at all. So let me explain why. The prefix para, derived from ancient Greek, has 2 broad uses in English. So if we take it right back to its ancient roots, we can use it as a preposition, i.e. a word that normally shows the relationship between nouns, often in terms of the when, where, how that thing is in a given situation, to roughly mean beside, or apart from, or next to. Or we can use it in its more modern sense, roughly as a preposition meaning in spite of, or despite. So in the case of paranormal, it would mean despite the normal, or in spite of the normal. Normal, however, is slightly more tricky, and it derives from the Latin norma, which, according to some chap called Klein, was very likely borrowed from the Greek gnomon. I probably bastardized that pronunciation, but don't worry, I live on the razor's edge, so... And it was used in the 17th century literally to mean carpenter's square, rule or pattern. So carpenter's squares were obviously used for precisely what they are today, a template by which to reproduce an exact right angle. So we call it a standard. This is incredibly interesting, but you already knew this. Why am I going to the trouble of spelling it out like a common pedant? And the reason is, you're right. It's mostly because I get some sadistic pleasure out of sounding like an insufferable know-all, but more importantly, I think that it's really worth knowing the meaning of each half of the word to get a better sense of what's, in my view, the best way to think of how paranormal stands in relation to science, rational inquiry, and, most importantly for this channel, skepticism. So, just for a moment, let's think of the scientific method and all the other tools of rationality we bring to bear along with it as our norma, i.e. like a carpenter's square, a standard template of critical thinking and rational inquiry. Then we can think of the paranormal as any phenomenon that doesn't fit that template, and we get one of our standard uses of paranormal in common parlance. We hear people using the term in this way all the time, particularly in the paranormal community, with statements like, ghosts are real for me, they just don't fit with the scientific way of thinking, so science is never going to prove their existence, they exist outside of science. However, the scientific method isn't really like the norma, or the carpenter's square, which is completely rigid because it's already perfect. It's not possible to improve upon, refine, or further develop an exact right angle because it's what we could call conceptually closed. That is, 2 adjacent lines at 90 degrees is an abstract concept which forms the definition of the right angle. To adjust it in any way would be to radically alter the concept such that it would no longer be a right angle. We can do a quick thought experiment to run this. I mean, we could change any part of that definition of 2 adjacent lines at 90 degrees by a small margin. Let's say 2 adjacent lines at 91 degrees, it would no longer be a right angle. And if the lines weren't adjacent, they couldn't obviously be at 90 degrees to one another, so they couldn't be a right angle. So improvement, refinement, and progress, however, are built into the very fabric of the scientific method. So, while science may at any given point employ a suite of tools, like the carpenter's square, to carry out the method, it is not itself those tools. It's a goal, or an enterprise, in devising the absolute best methods of understanding the world. As such, the standards or methods are always subject to improvement, and phenomena always qualify for inclusion within our body of scientific knowledge if they can satisfy those ever-improving standards. Hence, it seems like a confusion about science to consider anything most people refer to as paranormal as being outside of the scope of scientific inquiry. Science is set up in such a way that if at some point in the future we've devised a rigorous method which allows us to confirm the existence of life after death, or ghosts, or gremlins, or fairies, then that will just become part of our scientific understanding of how the universe works. Of course, the fact that many people, including some very prominent scientists throughout history, are oblivious to this confusion has led to some, let's say, very embarrassing cases where phenomena have been completely placed outside of the scope of scientific inquiry to disastrous effect. So let's look at one such case. So for as long as recorded history, we pernickety primates have been ever fascinated with trying to work out what the world is like at a fundamental level. So for ages we've tried to sort out what kinds of stuff fundamentally the universe is comprised of by answering questions such as, is there a mind separate from the body? What kinds of physical stuff are there? For ancient humans, right up until fairly recent history, the project has been fairly slow. And by the end of the Renaissance period, towards the end of the 17th century, just prior to the scientific revolution, it had almost ground to a halt altogether. Now, that's not to say we didn't have some fairly good stabs at it, and some of them were cases of being right by accident, and some of them were plausible but just way off the mark and running in the wrong direction. It's not to say that we didn't develop some invaluable tools along the way, whether they be thinking tools or physical implements, but in general, natural philosophers and polymaths, as they were called then, made very well-educated guesses with hugely varying consequences. My favourite examples of success in this area is that of Eratosthenes. He was a formidable Greek thinker who in his later life was convinced to move to Egypt by Ptolemy III to become the librarian of the Great Library of Alexandria. Eratosthenes managed to calculate the circumference of the Earth without ever leaving Egypt, using a combination of abstract reasoning and crude measurement as confirmation, an astounding precursor to modern science. In fact, Eratosthenes' calculation was so accurate that had Christopher Columbus chosen not to ignore it 1700 years later, preferring instead to believe that the Earth was 1/3 smaller than Eratosthenes' estimate, he'd have avoided one of the greatest blunders in the history of navigation. Though, as the late Christopher Hitchens often enjoyed reminding us, being evolved primates with adrenal glands far too large and prefrontal lobes far too small, we also had our fair share of blunders in a bid to work out what the world is like. Nevertheless, we also had our fair share of accidental successes in our bid to work out what the world is like. Good old Democritus, who largely went unnoticed in ancient Athens, stumbled upon a basic theory of atoms which, it turns out, was essentially right. He'd take a little shell from the beach, break it in half, then break it in half again, until he was left with a fine powder that would divide no more. That, he reasoned, must be the indivisible building block of all matter and life. Aristotle, however, did all he could to discredit the idea, preferring to believe that all of matter was comprised out of tiny bits of the 4 basic elements, which were earth, fire, air, and water. For Aristotle, this perfectly explained how maggots and other fauna seemed able to spontaneously arise from dead animal carcasses. They must have simply been able to form from these elements, right? What do we learn from this museum of fumblings in the dark? Despite having a lot of high-powered brains on the case to develop plausible theories and information, we had no principled method for ruling out the false ones until Galileo popped along and we took another rather large step up our bell curve, which I'll give a link to that video where I describe what my bell curve is. Galileo radically advanced ideas like Eratosthenes about observation and experiment and impressed upon natural philosophers that they will be using mathematical modelling to test, confirm and deny what the world is like all the way to the truth. This gave us a great grounding for a framework in deciding between rival theories. I like to think of it as a handy pair of armbands with which to swim through a disgustingly muddy bog of information. As far as driving us tantalisingly close to a beautiful method for progressing towards a completely physical description of the way the world is, Galileo's method, and hyper-advanced methods which came after, are the only game in town. It's highly embarrassing, then, that we've only recently, and by recently I mean within the last 40 years, started to make substantial progress in how to answer the question of what consciousness is. This is largely because our experts have, until recently, and in various ways, placed consciousness outside of the scope of post-Galilean inquiry. This has meant that, instead of developing a principled account of consciousness which allows us to pinpoint precisely what we're dealing with when we talk about it, we've had to settle for, let's say, fuzzier definitions. Thomas Nagel, for example, loosely defines consciousness as the what it's like part of a phenomena, or the inner experience, the subjective experience. Prior to that, in the 16th century, Descartes obviously and famously relegated discussion on consciousness to an ethereal realm beyond the scope of mathematical inquiry. Conversely, in the 20th century, behaviourists asserted that all there is to consciousness is what can be described in terms of observable behaviour. Neither answer really seems to get anywhere near the problem of why we have a qualitative experience when we smell garlic, see red, or understand the proposition right angles are 2 adjacent lines at 90 degrees. So we fast forward to the modern era then, and more interdisciplinary experts on consciousness have realised this problem, whether they believe that it's possible to find a more refined scientific method to adequately explain it or not, and nevertheless experts at the frontier of our understanding on the subject are for the first time in history ready and capable to work out how to begin to answer it in a principled rather than speculative way. However, one can't help but wonder that if we'd only realised this sooner, we would have been able to save the embarrassment of the problem by giving ourselves a much needed head start. So if we think of the so-called paranormal phenomena as those just after the scientific revolution thought about consciousness and hold them off the table of scientific investigation, it seems difficult to see how we're ever going to start making sense of what these phenomena are, whether there be any substance to them or not, or if they turn out to be a tapestry of human mistakes or not. In order to do that, we need to subject them to our best investigative methods. And as it turns out, science is simply, by its very definition, whatever turns out to be our most complete, best understanding of how the world works in and of itself. It proceeds by a blend of experiment, observation, hypothesis, and a philosophical underpinning which champions the careful, rational weighing of theoretical virtues such as simplicity, elegance, and explanatory power. Most importantly, if a scientist is exercising best practice, she should want her data to be the subject of the most stringent critical review from her peers available. If her theory survives this process, she can enjoy all of the perks of having contributed to human understanding. If it fails, she should want, as much as any of her critical peers, to throw it out like last night's chip paper, because the goal is not her own personal gain, it's to bring our richest critical methods to bear on the question of how the world works. Conversely, if any paranormal claims are true, then they should be able to survive the harshest scrutiny and walk away unscathed. Any genuine researcher, as many of them claim to be, and I've said this before about particular researchers, they should want their work to be subject to this kind of view. And in my view, if they are reluctant to do so, it's really hard to see what their claims or explanations actually help us to understand about the nature of the universe or reality, besides what they've come up with in their bedrooms, with very intricate, unfalsifiable ways to validate their own pre-existing worldview. At best, and at worst, they're very happy spoon-feeding their audiences, who are in some cases vulnerable with unsubstantiated work. So, in this series, which will focus on ghosts, aliens, psychics, and all manner of spooky, wonderful things that litter the internet, I just want to encourage us all to drop the term paranormal and think of each subject as either currently unsupported by science, i.e. the best investigative method ever devised, or inconsistent with science, i.e. false. In fact, we'll proceed as if any instance of para in this context is just as null and void as we've determined that it is for paranormal. In each case, I'll try and outline the kind of data or experimental conditions each of these practitioners or the objects they purport to study could satisfy in order to get accepted as scientific knowledge, and in each case I'll explain why that hasn't been possible or is actively discouraged by the leaders in these fields. So there's your Pocket Skeptimist short introduction to what we're going to be talking about in this series, and also a brief argument as to why we need to drop the term paranormal. See you guys later. Pocket Skeptimist is completely self-funded and self-produced. I don't have any sponsors, I don't monetize my videos, and I don't have any external funding. So a lot of my own time goes into writing, researching, editing, and producing the videos that I make and upload to YouTube. So if you did like a video, please give it a thumbs up. If you like the channel, please give it a subscribe. And if you just wanted to share your view, then please do leave a comment in the video below. I try my very best to respond directly to each and every comment that I receive. So please do get involved. Look forward to seeing you.